Hey friends, we are going to talk today about science in psychology because we don't want to just be sort of throwing ideas out there and saying, here's how we think the world works. I think we talked a little bit in our last discussion about how that has caused some problems in the past when we are dealing with some of our earlier psychological researchers and theorists. Um, we want to be sure that we are depending on information that is valid and accurate when we are trying to help people and make decisions, or maybe not decisions, but determinations about um, what is really going on in human behavior. We want to make sure that we're getting it right. And one of the ways that we do that best is through the application of scientific principles. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about how what those scientific principles are, and then how those are applied in psychology in terms of actually doing research, um, so that we are both doing accurate and valid research, but also so that we are doing ethical research. And then we'll talk a little bit about the statistics that we use to make sure that we've got the numbers right. Okay. All right. So this is information that applies broadly across your entire life, increasingly so as we live in a world that has tons and tons of information that gets thrown at us every single day that we are expected to evaluate and decide whether it's true or false. Everybody wants you to believe something, and they would like you to behave then in a particular way based on what they're asking you to believe, because that's what all human persuasion is about. Whether you're trying to get somebody to buy something, or vote a particular way, or treat the people around them a particular way, pretty much all of the institutional structures that we have in our society, be they government or religion or other groups that have vested interest in changing society, up to and including, people on social media. These are all intended to be persuasive messages in either explicit or implicit ways that are designed to get us to think differently and behave differently. Okay, so not all of these messages are of equal value. And certainly, bringing it back down to sort of the psychology level, there are a lot of different ways that you can explain why people do what they do. They are not all explanations of equal merit. Some of them are defensible, and others are not, and simply depend on you not thinking about them very hard in order to get you to believe them. So, what we want to do first and foremost as scientists is we want to learn to think critically. We want to make sure that we know what is being asked of us in terms of what am I supposed to think, what am I supposed to believe, and that we can then evaluate the evidence in favor of that idea and against that idea, and then come to the best decision that we are capable of making. So these 5 questions that you've got on this little pegboard here can lead you in that direction. What am I being asked to believe? What evidence is there in support of this position? Now, looking at that evidence, is there some other way that that evidence could be interpreted other than the one that is being presented to me? And then, of those options in terms of the interpretation of that evidence, what additional evidence would I need in order to evaluate between them? And then, based on all of those previous questions, what's my best conclusion that I can make? You think that way, and you can really sift through a lot of the chaff or a lot of the nonsense that people bring up and want you to believe. Okay, one of the things that we want to look for in our evidence in support of a particular position is objectivity. We want to make sure that we are being objective in the evaluation um, of evidence, and that the people who are presenting evidence to us are being objective in the presentation of their evidence rather than subjective, right? So objective means that you are trying to remove your own biases and feelings and point of view and just present bare facts. Subjectivity is the opposite. Subjectivity is entirely based on your point of view. So, if you are driving down the road and somebody cuts you off, an objective way to state that, well, let's first say it the way that we would, right? What a jerk! They cut me off. You're a bad person. You're a jerk. Jerks do that, right? That is a very subjective point of view. It is based in your feelings, how you are responding to that sort of scary moment of getting cut off, and may not necessarily be widely applicable to an outside observer. It is based in your point of view. Now, what we want to try to do, maybe not necessarily in that moment, but as we are evaluating evidence, is try to be a little more neutral about it. Try and remove our own opinion and point of view. So instead of saying, you cut me off because you're a jerk, instead, you could say, once again to yourself, because you're in the car and you're not actually communicating with the other person, that person moved their car in front of mine at an unsafe distance. Right? That appeared to be too close. That was not. How many car lengths is it that you're supposed to stay back? 2, 3? I can't even remember anymore. I got to go back to driver's ed. But you see the difference between those statements, right? One is depending on observable, concrete facts, data, while the other depends on emotion and your point of view. Now, I don't want to suggest that our point of view is worthless, right? We depend on our point of view to make pretty much all of our decisions. But being aware of it and trying to take our own emotions and desires into account as we are evaluating evidence is a really good idea, because our emotions absolutely can lead us astray. Now, objectivity is a goal in science. It is, however, actually an unattainable one. You can never entirely remove your own point of view and your own biases from your observations. Because, I mean, just from a physical perspective, you are standing where you are standing, and so you are going to see things from the point of view in which you physically are. You can't eliminate that. Now, you can try to take other points of view into account, say it looked like this from where I was standing, but somebody else was standing off to the side, and here's what they have to say, and you can get closer to it. But still, you're the one speaking, and you're the one directing the conversation when you're reporting the results of any particular outcome. And so, even in trying to minimize our own biases and point of view, we need to recognize that we're never entirely successful. And if you go and read scientific articles, you'll see that different researchers do a better or worse job of getting themselves out of the way and letting the data speak for themselves. And the best ones are the ones who are the most objective, even if nobody is perfectly objective. Right? Now, inherent in this idea of objectivity is the idea that we want to collect data, we want information, we want evidence that is by its nature observable, systematic, and repeatable, right? I want to be able to say, here's what happened in this situation, and describe the situation to you sufficiently that if you want to, you could go out and observe the exact same thing under the same conditions, right? That is the kind of evidence that we need to rely on when it comes to science, because that's the only thing that we can all agree on, right? If it is observable and repeatable and somebody can go out and do it themselves and see what happens, then there's not really a whole lot of argument to be had, because it's right there and you can see it, right? Now, little sidebar for a second here. Is observable, repeatable, tangible evidence the only thing that we should rely on in our lives in order to make our decisions? Well, no, in my opinion. Now, this isn't in the textbook. This is my own sort of take on things, so take it for what it's worth and toss it out if it's useless to you. But the fact of the matter is that just like nobody can be perfectly objective, nobody depends entirely on um, empirical evidence to make their decisions. We do take our own emotions into account. Even if we're not letting them rule us, they still should affect us, right? They still should inform our decisions. And sometimes we are asked to make decisions or have to make decisions when there is not sufficient empirical evidence available to us. And some of the most important questions that humans have to ask can't and don't have empirical evidence to back them up. And that's why people disagree on a lot of these things so strongly. What does it mean to be human? Is there a life after this one? Was there a life before this one? Is there a soul in humans or in other creatures for that matter? Um, these are not testable questions, at least not with the tools that we've got right now. But you still have to make your best decision based on whatever evidence you're able to collect. And I would suggest, once again, this is just my opinion, that in some of these cases, you may never get the tangible evidence that you're looking for. And maybe it's important to learn to make decisions as a human um, in the absence of empirical evidence so that we can learn how to do that too, because we're not always going to have all of the data that we need. That's not how life really works. Now, that's what science is about, right? Is going about and collecting more evidence on that we don't have in new and novel ways so that we can answer the basic questions more accurately. I have no doubt that that process will proceed. But in the meantime, we've still got to live our lives and decide who we are and what we care about and how we're going to face the world. And while science is really, really good at answering um, the how questions, it is not always great at answering the why questions of life. So just, something to think about as you're approaching this. I sure don't want to ask you to dismiss scientific evidence. That's not what I'm trying to say. I am trying to say that there are other ways of understanding the world that sometimes move beyond scientific evidence. And you have to decide for yourself how much of each of those types of evidence you are going to depend on, and in what proportions, and how exactly you put that all together, because it's your life, not mine, right? So there we go. Okay, now going back to our conversation on uh, empirical evidence and actually developing scientific ideas. Um, what we need to do first is have a question that we want answered. If we're going to collect data, let's not just do it randomly. Let's have some focused idea that we want to zero in on so that we can collect meaningful evidence. Now, these ideas come in two different shapes. Unfortunately, these two shapes have names that we use interchangeably in everyday speech. They are hypotheses and theories. Now, you have, I am certain, heard someone say, I have a theory about that. Actually, what they probably mean when they say that is, I have an idea about how these things go together that I've just sort of come up with based on, what I've seen in my own life. That is actually a hypothesis, not a theory, because that is an idea that has not yet been empirically tested and has then survived that empirical testing. So a hypothesis is a proposed explanation for the relationship between variables, if you want to say it that way. A theory is uh, a set of relationships that has actually been tested and survived the test of time. So think of the theory of relativity that Einstein came up with. That was his idea about the relationship between energy and mass and other things. I'm not a physicist, sorry. uh, Now, he gathered evidence, empirical evidence, in support of that hypothesis. And that hypothesis has now lasted for many decades And, every few years or so, somebody else will come along and try to undermine it. Say, hey, I think I've got some evidence that suggests that maybe Einstein's theory of relativity was incorrect or incomplete. However, as the scientific community, the physicist community gets together and looks at the new evidence, at least so far, there hasn't been anything that has conclusively ruled out Einstein's ideas on relativity. And so if you've got a hypothesis that has been tested and retested and challenged, and those challenges have failed over the course of years and decades, that's a theory. That's something that is testable and repeatable and that we have evidence for. Now, a theory is not a fact. There could still be evidence forthcoming that could upend Einstein's theory of relativity, but until that day, it's a good operating principle if you are focused on those particular ideas of energy and mass and whatever else the theory of relativity is about. So, next time somebody says, I have a theory, you can be like, well, actually, you have a hypothesis. Or maybe don't do that if you would like to keep having friends. I don't know. That's up to you. Because nobody likes that guy. Okay, so you can see sort of the relationship here. We have an idea that we create a hypothesis. We want our hypothesis to be testable, right? We put it in some form, the question that we have, so that we can then test that idea and see if it is correct. Based on the results of that testing, which is our systematic observation here, we either say, nope, I was wrong about that, let's go back to the drawing board and create a new hypothesis, or say, yes, I have come up with evidence in support of my hypothesis, and I think I'm right. Okay? So, we move through these steps in the scientific method. We observe the world around us. That then leads to research questions. I look around me in the world that exists and I go, I think redheads have no soul. I don't actually think that, by the way, but let's say that that's my idea. Any redheads listening, I'm sure you're a decent person and have murdered no more than 3 people. Okay, so that's my idea. How am I going to test that? That's the next step, right? I need to create a testable hypothesis. Well, that's where I'm going to run into trouble with this particular hypothesis, because how do you measure souls? Souls are famously resistant to testing their existence, right? I mean, there have been movies made about it. We don't know how to do that. But let's say that I create a machine that I can have somebody step into, and it measures the size and quality of their soul, right? All right, I'm going to make a lot of money off of that, I have no doubt, if I'm able to create such a thing. I am then going to have to bring a bunch of people and put them through my machine, redheads and non-redheads alike, in order to test the havingness of souls across individuals. And then based on the data that I collect, I am going to draw my conclusions and either say, great, I was right, redheads are all soulless, or more likely I'll be like, yeah, maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe I just dated a redhead once and it was a bad experience. Actually, I never did. I don't know where I came up with that idea. It's just one of those things that people say. I don't know. Okay, so where am I going to find my redheads, right? What am I? How am I going to run this study? Well, there's a couple of different levels of people that you have to think about when you are wanting to collect data like this. There's the population that you are interested in, and then there's the people that you're actually going to test, right? The population level based on my hypothesis that I am interested in, is all redheads. However, I probably don't have the time, energy, and or money to go visit every single redhead in the world and put them through my hypothetical machine. So I'm not going to be able to test all redheads. What I should do instead, what I'm going to have to do instead, is collect a small group of redheads that hopefully is representative of the larger population of redheads in the world, right? And that's going to be my sample, right? I pick people from the population and try to test them. And then based on what happens in my sample, I'm going to draw conclusions as to what is going on in the larger population without necessarily testing everybody in the population, because that's simply beyond my means, right? So this is how all research gets done. There is some population of interest. I am interested in people who have recovered from cancer. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to have access to all of those folks. I'm going to recruit a few of them and try to do my best to make sure that the few that I gather look like, represent, uh, resemble the larger population, right? So I'm going to want to make sure that if I'm looking at, I'm switching examples now, if I'm looking at cancer survivors, that I don't just, go to my local university and recruit students and teachers, because that's a very small subset of the population, right? That's folks who either work at a college or go to college, and there's a whole slew of folks who never come within 5 miles of a college in our society, that could very well have something different going on in terms of their cancer survivorship than the people I just happen to pick because they're right around me, right? I want to make sure that my sample is a representative one in order to be able to generalize my results um, from my sample out to the population level, or else I may draw incomplete or wrong conclusions if my sample is a non-representative one. Okay. All right, so let's talk for a minute about some of the ways that we can collect data, or that we do collect data in psychology. Um, the first and probably most intuitive one is naturalistic observation. This is going out and looking for the thing that you are interested in, right? So I'm going to have to switch examples again. If I am interested in the interaction style or play styles of 3-year-olds versus 5-year-olds in our society, well, I can go out and observe that behavior. I can go to a playground with my notebook and just watch kids at play, right? Because that is actually the thing that I care about, is childhood play at ages 3 and 5. Well, I can just look at it as it happens, right? Now, you want to be careful about that, right? I probably shouldn't show up outside the fence of my local elementary school wearing a trench coat and sunglasses. I'm probably going to get arrested, right? But, in certain public areas, you go to a public park or to the mall or something like that, and you can observe kids at play. Probably get some weird looks from parents even still, but you get the idea. Jane Goodall is a fantastic example of naturalistic observation. She was a chimpanzee researcher and actually went out into the jungles where the chimpanzees lived and built little shelters for herself, and would stay there for weeks and sometimes months on end, so that the chimps would become accustomed to her presence and go about their everyday business without being scared of her or running away from her. And because she was watching them in their natural environment and carefully describing the behavior that she observed, we now know much more about the social structures of chimpanzee groups than we ever did before, because she actually watched it happening. Now, naturalistic observation is fantastic because it's so valid, I guess I should say. We'll talk about what validity means a little bit later in this discussion. But it is the thing that you were looking for. You were actually going out and finding the behavior that you care about in the wild and observing it and systematically recording your observations. This is fantastic because it's real behavior, unlike some of the other stuff that we'll talk about with experimentation or other things, where you're asking people about behavior or observing the behavior in a lab in a sort of unreal situation. We don't have any of those problems with naturalistic observation. This is the stuff that we care about as it's happening. Now, it's not a perfect way to collect all data for a few different reasons. One, Sometimes people will act differently just because they're being watched, right? If I were to go to your house and sit down at your breakfast table with your family and say, "You guys just do your thing. I'm just gonna, watch and take notes." Your family is probably not going to behave as they normally would because there's a stranger in the house. And so you're going to, maybe be on better behavior than you would otherwise, or maybe talk less than you otherwise would because, this is our private space and you're in it. And that's weird, right? Also, as you can see from that example, you may not necessarily be able to observe the behavior that you are interested in the wild, so to speak. Not everything happens in the wild, and who's going to let me sit down at their breakfast table to observe them? No, they want to have breakfast with their families. Thank you very much. This becomes even more relevant depending on what you are researching. What if you are researching sexual behavior? I mean, that generally speaking does not happen out in the open, right? And so you want to uh, you're only going to be able to use naturalistic observation under certain circumstances. But for the circumstances for which it works, it is a very powerful and very reliable method to gather the information that you're looking for. Okay, another way you can go about collecting data is using case studies. Sometimes the thing that you're looking for doesn't happen very often. And so you can't just go out and find it, right? Maybe I am interested in researching the resilience of left-handed cancer survivors who are only children. I'm not going to find a whole lot of those folks. I'm going to have to go out looking for them. And even going out looking for them, I'm probably only going to find one or two, right? And so in that situation where it's hard to find what you're looking for, when you do find what you're looking for, you get as much data from those individuals as is possible. So let me refer to the case of HM, a man named Henry Meliason. He was referred to when he was still alive as patient HM in order to preserve his anonymity. He suffered from severe epilepsy, and this was in the days sort of in the late 60s when we still didn't necessarily have a great idea about what was going on in the brain. And so they performed brain surgery on him and removed the corpus callosum, which is the bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain that passes information back and forth. But they also removed brain matter around the corpus callosum, including the hippocampus, which at the time we didn't really know much about. But one of the things that they found with Meliason after his brain surgery is that he could no longer form new declarative memories. He couldn't learn new things. You could have a conversation with him, but, or I guess I should say, let me simplify. He couldn't move new information into long term memory. So as soon as you walked away from a conversation that you were having with him, he would have no idea what conversation had just transpired, or in fact, that he had even had a conversation with you, because once it left his short term memory, it was simply gone. He couldn't store it long term. If you've ever watched the movie Memento, that's a similar situation. You've got a man with brain damage who can't form new memories. We learned a lot about what the hippocampus does by studying Henry Meliason. Now, it's not many folks that are missing their hippocampuses. Hippocampi? Whatever. So, at any rate, researchers uh, spent a lot of time and effort on Henry Meliason, testing him in a dozen different ways to see what he was capable of and not capable of. And that's what a case study is. You get as much information from a single individual or a very small group of individuals um, as you possibly can. And you can learn a lot. And in fact, we know a lot about what the hippocampus does because of Henry Meliason. Now, one of the dangers of case studies is that you may mistake something that is unique to the individual as being due to the condition that you're looking for, right? So maybe I don't know, I'm making this up. this next thing that I'm going to say, so please don't think this is real. Maybe Henry Molaison had some sort of speech impediment. The people studying him might have come to the conclusion that the loss of his hippocampus caused that speech impediment, when in fact it could have just been him and he'd always been that way, right? So that's one of the dangers of case studies, is you may mistake something that is unique to the individual as being general to all of the people who have the characteristic that you are studying, right? Okay. Now, another way to collect data, this is probably the most popular one in psychology, is the survey. Surveys abound in our society now. Everybody is always asking you to answer a few multiple choice questions, and you go to every single website and they're, hey, will you take a quick survey so that we can know more about you and use your data, right? Surveys are great because they're cheap and they're quick, right? You can get a lot of information from a lot of people very quickly, especially in this online day and age where literally there are websites you can go to where you can just like answer surveys, like complete surveys, and get paid for it, right? Not well, you don't get paid well, but you can make a little bit of money doing it, right? Now, surveys are, because they're so cheap and so easily accessible and you gather exactly the data that you're looking for, are fantastic for researchers because we need lots of data. It does, however, have its downsides, that being that you may ask questions in such a way that people feel inclined to give one answer over another one, so they may not necessarily answer honestly, but instead give you what they think you're looking for. If you look at political surveys, this is rampant, right? Um, and it happens all across the board. But the one that I'm thinking of, I saw a political survey that President Trump sent out a couple of years ago, where the wording was so biased that it was obvious that they wanted you to respond in a particular way, right? Now, he's not the only one who does this, of course. People across the political spectrum do this. He was just particularly ham-fisted in his efforts. Not even him, his team, right? But nevertheless, this is one of the problems with surveys. Depending on how you ask the question, it may influence the answer that you get. And if you want to really get to the truth of what people are thinking and feeling, that's not the best way to do it. Now, you may not intend to do that, but sometimes just asking something in what seems like an innocuous way may lead somebody to a particular answer. Also, you may ask somebody about something that they don't necessarily have an answer for, but they'll still give you one because they want to be good participants, right? They want to give you the information that you're looking for. And so if I ask you, for instance, to report on your level of self-control, you can probably give me an answer based on how you're feeling right now. But as it turns out, based on the research that I've looked at, because I have looked at a lot of this research because I did my grad school work on self-control. I'm a social psychologist by nature. It turns out that people's answers on how much self-control they have don't actually correlate very strongly with their performance on self-control tasks. So you'll give me an answer, but you're probably not going to be right about what that answer actually is, because it's just information that you don't have access to internally. It's like me asking you what your blood pressure is. Unless you've got some machine that measures it for you, you're not going to know what your blood pressure is. You may know when it gets high, right? You feel that feeling of pressure in your head because you're super stressed out. That's high blood pressure. But you're not going to be able to attach a number to it with any sort of reliability. But you'll probably still try to give me an answer if I ask you that in a survey, right? So this is one of the shortcomings of surveys. You may get bad data. There's also the problem that people may just like want the $5 that you're trying to give them, and so just like see all the way down without even reading your questions. Bad data, right? Okay. Those are our primary methods of collecting data in psychology. There are others, but these are the primary ones. Now let's talk a little bit about study design, which is related to data collection, but not exactly the same thing. It has more to do with what are you trying to establish with your study? Are you just looking at things to see whether they are related, or are you trying to say that one thing causes some other thing? If you're just looking to see what the relationships are between things, you're going to use something that we call a correlational study, where you collect all of the information about both of the variables that you are interested in at the same time, and then just look to see if they are related to each other. So you can see here a couple of scatter plots, and that's how we do that's how we look at our data when it comes to correlational studies. You take one variable on the x-axis, sorry, that's the horizontal one, one variable on the x-axis, one variable on the y-axis, and then plot everybody's score on both of those things. You've done this since like the 5th grade, so I won't belabor the point. But you can see a couple of examples here. Here we have a situation where we are looking at people's hour of studying per week, if you look at the graph on the left, and their grade point average. And you can see that there is a relationship between these two variables based on the shape of our scatter plot, where the dots are, right? It looks like as the number of studying hours per week goes up, GPA also goes up on average, right? If I were to take this cloud of dots, I could draw a line through the middle of them and it would be trending upward, right? That is a positive correlation. As one of the variables increases, the other variable also increases, right? You can also have a negative correlation where as one of the variable increases, the other one decreases. So the example here on the right is number of hours of TV watch per week and GPA, right? Now, we don't want to think this way because we all have our Netflix queue that we're trying to get through, but um, this is pretty reliable across a bunch of different studies. The more TV you watch per week, the lower your grades are likely to be. Now, there are some outliers here, right? So you look, it's not a perfect relationship. There's some variability there. But generally speaking, as you look across individuals, um, that's what the relationship is. It's a negative correlation. Now, when you're looking at correlations, we can actually calculate a number that describes the relationship when you're talking about a correlation. That number can range anywhere from +1 to -1. The further you get away from 0 in either direction, the stronger that relationship is, and that's what this slide is showing you here. A correlation of 0 is no relationship. So let's think of two uncorrelated variables. Weight and IQ. There is, to the best of my knowledge at least, so feel free to email me with evidence to the contrary if you know it, but to the best of my knowledge, there is no correlation between body weight and IQ, right? So that means there is no greater likelihood for you to have a high IQ if you are low in weight than there is if you are high in weight. Or conversely, there is no greater likelihood that you are going to have a high weight if you have a high IQ than if you have a low IQ, right? Those are two things that simply don't correspond to each other. They don't correlate with each other. And so you can see sort of the scatter plot there in the middle with the 0 correlation is just a shapeless cloud. It doesn't go in any direction, right? But if as you move further away from 0 and there is an increasing relationship between these variables, meaning they track together more closely, then you are going to have a stronger correlation. Now, the strength is equal on either side, right? A correlation of 0.95 is equal in strength to a correlation of -0.95. So it's not that positive is stronger than negative. It has to do with the description of that relationship. Positive correlations are ones where as one of the variable moves up, the other variable also moves up in score. Negative correlations are the ones where as one of the variables moves up in score, the other one moves down in score, right? Like we showed on the last slide. Okay, make sure you know what a correlation is and sort of what the different numbers that can be assigned to a correlation are. And I'm not going to ask you to compute one. That's, a statistics class, not this class. But I do want you to know sort of what a correlation means in terms of what the numbers are, right? And you can see sort of the different levels of a small correlation, a medium, a large, very large. I don't necessarily need you to know those cutoffs, but I do want you to be able to describe what a correlation is. Okay, now one thing about correlational studies is because we're collecting all of our data at the same time, we can't infer causality for either of our variables. We make this mistake all of the time in the media that we consume in our society when it comes to the description of studies, both psychological and otherwise, where there is something that is correlational in nature, but then when journalists report on it, they talk about one of the things causing the other thing, right? Um, and this is a problem because we can't actually establish any causality when we are simply observing the variables as they exist and reporting on the relationship between them. Because it is equally possible for a correlational study for the causal link to go in either direction. So let's look at some of the studies on video game violence and aggressiveness, right? That's something that we talk a lot about in our society, right? People are always blaming video games, violent video games, for causing aggressive behavior in kids, right? All the way back to the Columbine school shooting and beyond. Um, Most of the studies, however, are correlational in nature, meaning, yes, there is a relationship between uh, playing video games that are violent and engaging in aggressive behavior. And the everyday narrative that we are used to hearing is that it is the violent video games causing the aggressive behavior. However, it is equally likely, if all we've got is correlational data, that the causal link goes in the other direction, meaning that it is aggressive people that seek out violent video games. So yeah, there's a relationship, but I'm an aggressive person and I kind of like to hurt people and engage in violence. And so when I pick up a video game, I'm going to pick up, a shooter instead of Legend of Zelda, let's say, right? So this is the problem with correlational studies. They often get misunderstood, misinterpreted. You can't really talk about causality. Also, there is the issue of the third variable problem, which is what we've got on this slide here. Um, there may be, and in fact, in this particular case, is um, a third variable that drives the relationship between, or drives the correlation between the two variables that you are studying. And better research that has been done more recently shows that when you are bullied, not only are you more likely to prefer more violent video games, but you are also more likely to act out aggressively in school. And in fact, that drives the relationship between video games and violent video games and the enactment of aggression. Um, and so it's this third variable that is actually the operating one. It's not that the violent video games are causing the aggression. It's that people who are having trouble in their lives otherwise because they're not being treated well act out aggressively and also play violent video games, right? One of the famous third variable problems that I like to talk about is the very real and well-studied strong correlation between ice cream consumption and the homicide rate. As ice cream consumption goes up, so does the number of murders in that place. Watch out for eating that rocky road. You might just stab the person next to you. That's not actually what's going on. There is a third variable that is driving the relationship between those two. It's the heat, right? The hotter it is in a place, the more ice cream people eat. Also, the hotter it is, the more likely it is for tempers to boil over and for people to act out aggressively and enact violent crimes, like homicide, when the temperature is hot. So that's why there's a relationship between ice cream eating, or a correlation between ice cream eating and the murder rate. Not that ice cream causes murder or that murder causes ice cream. There's a third variable that is driving the relationship. Okay. Let's move away from correlational studies. Let's talk a little bit about experiments. Experiments are sort of the gold standard in psychology. This is the kind of work that we want to be doing most of the time, because experiments allow you to determine causality in a way that correlational studies don't. So what we have to do in order to determine causality is have control of the situation. We have to set up a scenario where the people involved are all doing the same thing, but then for half of the people, I tweak one little thing to see if it causes a difference on the outcome. If there is some difference between those groups on the outcome, it can only be because of the difference that I introduced, because everything else was the same for everybody, right? That's the basic idea of an experiment. And you can see how it's set up here. You split your people into two groups. One of them is a control group, the other one is an experimental group. They go through the exact same conditions with one important difference. For the experimental group, you are going to manipulate the independent variable. For the control group, you won't. And then you're going to see if there is some difference between these groups on an outcome variable that we call our dependent variable. Make sure you know those two words, or those two terms, independent variable, dependent variable. The independent variable is the one that you manipulate between your groups. The dependent variable is your outcome. Okay, so let me give you an example here. When I was a grad student, I ran a study on self-control where I was looking to see if self-control worked like a muscle. This is one of the popular analogies in social psychology for understanding how self-control operates. It's like a muscle. You use it, and then it gets tired. And so immediately after you use it, you're going to be worse at exerting self-control than you were beforehand. Also, like a muscle, it builds up over time. You can lift weights self-control wise, so to speak. But I was interested in this first aspect. Does it wear out like a muscle does? And so what I did is I had people come into my study and I had them all do the same task. Now, this doesn't even sound like a task when I describe it. They watched a film clip, right? It was from a movie called The Craft from the mid-90s, sort of like a PG-13 horror movie. There's this one super gross scene where one of the characters comes into a room and the room is just crawling with bugs, right? There's cockroaches in the sink. The toilet is overflowing with maggots. There are huge snakes like crawling in the window well because it's sort of like a basement room, and there are spiders dropping down into the girl's hair, and it's gross, right? You watch this scene, and the natural way that you want to watch this is like, gross, oh, that's so gross, right? That's sort of the natural response. Now, one of the groups, I sat them down in the room and said, you are going to be observed as you watch this clip. I need you to control your emotional response so that you stay totally neutral. Don't let your face move. Try not to feel anything. Just keep it totally even, right? The other group, I just said, watch the film clip. That was my control group. The experimental group, however, had to exert their self-control. This was a task that had been used in previous self-control literature and in previous studies. It is reliably shown to have to exert your self-control because these people, as they're watching the film clip, they go like this. Right? So they're trying not to respond. This is super gross and I hate it, but I'm not supposed to respond. This wears out their self-control. I then had everybody, after watching the film clip, engage in another self-control task that was a totally different kind of task, where I gave them 3 pages of single-spaced, like, legal documents. It was the same for everybody, but it was like stuff that was super, super boring and difficult to read. And I told them that they needed to cross out all of the E's on the pages unless the E was next to a vowel or a space. So tedious, difficult, you have to force yourself to keep doing it. So it's like, E, okay, do I cross? Oh, no, I don't cross out that one, it's next to an A. Oh, no, that's next to a space. Okay, I cross out that one, that one, that one. Not this one, okay, right? So it takes self-control. And then I measured how many mistakes they made on that task. It turned out that the people who had had to control their emotions while watching the film clip made more mistakes on the crossing out ease task than the people who just watched the clip normally and responded as they pleased, right? My independent variable was the exertion of self-control on the first task. My dependent variable was the second self-control task, where I actually measured how good they were at self-control to see if there was some difference between these two groups on that outcome. And as it turned out, there was, right? So that's a quick, not very quick, description of an experiment, right? Great. Now, we want to make sure, one thing I didn't talk about on this last slide, we want to make sure that we have a random sample from the population and that we are randomly assigning people to one of two, to our two groups. Random assignment. Now, we want to randomly pick people from the population because that actually mathematically turns out to be our best bet for getting a representative sample. We talked about how we want our sample to represent the population at large so that we can generalize our results to the population at large. Random samples do the best job of doing that. Now, we also want to, once people are participating in our study, randomly assign them to either be in the experimental group or in the control group. Because people show up with different levels of whatever it is that you are testing. Some of the people who came into my experiment were just high self-control people, and others of them were just naturally low self-control people, and I have no control over that because people differ from each other. However, if I randomly assign them to groups, a high self-control person has an equal likelihood of being assigned to either the experimental group or the control group. And if I have enough people, then individual differences should average out. Just mathematically speaking, that's how it works. Any individual differences should wash each other out so long as I've got a big enough sample and I randomly assign people to my groups. Okay, that's why we not only randomly pick our sample, but then randomly assign our sample to one of the two groups. Now, even if I do this properly, there are still other things that I need to be concerned about. I have to watch out for confounding variables. A confound is any variable that could explain my results other than my manipulation of my independent variable. So, for instance, in another self-control task that I did, one of the self-control tasks that I had people do was stick their hand in a bucket of ice water and see how long they could keep it in. As it turns out, this has more to do with people's level of self-control than it does their pain sensitivity. Now, I wanted, once again, for the self-control exertion to be the thing that mattered and how long people kept their hands in the water. However, I ran the study, and about 3/4 of the way through, I had this one participant that was like, that put her hand in the water and just kept it there for like 3 minutes. Now, most people leave their hand in there for 10 seconds or 15 seconds. They're like, I hate that. I'm done. But then this girl and a handful of others could just keep going forever. And so she turned to me after 3 minutes and she's like, do you want me to keep going? I can do this forever. I'm an athlete. Like, I'm on a student team and they have us take ice baths all the time. And I was like, oh crap, I've ruined my experiment, because a large proportion of my participants where I was were student athletes. Athletics was very important. I was at Duke for my grad school. And Duke athletics, especially in basketball, huge deal. So there was a large proportion of kids on the campus who were student athletes. And it just turned out that I had a bunch of them in my study. And so whether or not the students were athletes did far more to explain how long they kept their hand in the water than did any previous self-control exertion that I had tried to manipulate in the lab. That then became a confounding variable. It explained my outcomes better than my manipulation did. And so I needed to go back to the drawing board and come up with some task that student athletes wouldn't differ on, because the ice bucket task was a problematic one for them. Okay, so other things that can ruin your research. You want to make sure that you are not treating your two groups differently. And one of the ways to do this is to have somebody else actually run the study for you if you are the researcher. Because if you're the researcher and you're also running the study, you may, without even meaning to, treat the two groups differently because you know how you want it to turn out. And so it becomes very hard to not like sort of say things a little bit differently to your control group than you do to your experimental group in order to, sort of hedge your bets and try to get the differences that you're looking for. Now, all you have to do is hire a research assistant, costs some money, but it's better because then you are not actually, the person who actually cares about the outcome is not the person who is actually running the people through the study. And so experimenter bias becomes less of a problem. Okay, here's another example of a simple experiment. We want to know whether listening to music helps with studying. So what are we going to do? We're going to get, of our possible population of students, I am going to randomly select a handful or a double handful. Really, in any experiment, you kind of want at least 20 people in each group in order for the math to work out properly, statistically speaking. Take stats if you're more interested in why that is. I'm going to randomly assign those individuals to either my experimental group or my control group. They are going to study the same material under the same conditions, only for my experimental group, there is going to be music playing. Mozart, let's say, right? And for my control group, there is going to be no music playing. I am then going to test everybody on the material that they studied. And if there are any differences between groups in terms of how well they do on that testing, it can only be because there is some advantage or disadvantage to listening to music when you study, right? Because I've got enough people that any individual differences should wash themselves out. That's why we randomly assign. And the only difference between the two groups is, did they listen to music or not, right? And so any differences on test scores should come from that manipulation of the independent variable. Okay, great. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Other ways that we can, other study designs that are sometimes useful, moving beyond just a correlational study or an experimental study. Sometimes we want to look at how things change over time. This is especially true in developmental psychology, where we are looking at how people change as they age, right? There are a few different ways to do this. You can, if you're interested in how people differ at different ages, you could bring a bunch of people in at different ages, all at the same time, right? So I'm interested in language development in children. So I bring in a group of 8-year-olds, and I bring in a group of 10-year-olds, and I bring in a group of 12-year-olds, and I test them all on their language skills. I can see age differences across those different groups. That is one way to do it, and that's called cross-sectional design, right? It's like chopping down a tree and looking at all of the rings in the stump. You're looking at a cross-section of that tree. And once again, you're looking at different groups all at the same time. That's cross-sectional. Now, this is a problem when it comes to development, because those are different kids and they went through different things and maybe experienced the same events differently. And those, what we call cohort effects, a cohort is just people your age, can get mixed up with the changes that occur due to physical maturation or brain maturation. In order to address that, we use longitudinal studies, where instead of getting a bunch of different kids of different ages all at the same time, I grab some 8-year-olds and test their language skills, and then bring back those same 8-year-olds when they're 10 and test their skills again, and the same kids when they're 12. And that is what we call a longitudinal design, right? Bringing the same people back at different time points over time. Now, a mixed longitudinal design is actually when you do both of those things at the same time, right? You get kids of different ages and then follow them all over time. And that way, when you do it that way, in a mixed study like that, you can really tease apart quite successfully maturational processes from cohort effects and actually see, oh, these kids are getting better as they age in these ways, but these two groups differ from each other because of this particular thing that happened, right? Okay. All right, let's move on and talk about ethics a little bit, okay? We want to, as we are gathering data and trying to talk about how humans change over time, we want to make sure that we're not hurting anybody and that we are engendering trust in psychology as a science. Especially among older individuals, this is sometimes rare in our society. I remember once having a sprinkler guy come to my house. He was an older fella, probably pushing 70, still sprier than I was and knows 10 times as much about sprinklers as I do. And so he was working on my sprinklers, and we were chatting. And when I told him that I was a psychology professor, he immediately like clammed up and didn't want to talk to me because he did not trust psychologists. Because, especially amongst older folks, there is this sort of sense that psychologists are messing with people and ruining things. They may have come by some of these ideas honestly, because there have been abuses in psychological research and in medical research as well that might lead people to not trust psychologists, right? And so we want to make sure in this day and age that as we are finding out about people, we are treating them well and protecting their confidentiality and making sure that that we're not causing more problems as we're trying to solve problems for humanity, right? And you can see some of the guidelines that the APA has come up with here when it comes to engaging in ethical research. People have to be able to know what they're doing when they get into your research, and they have to know what the benefits are and what the risks are, and they have to be able to withdraw at any time for whatever reason. We can't hold them against their will, right? We want to make sure that we're protecting their data and keeping them safe and not lying to them unless the research absolutely demands, unless the information that you're looking for can't be found in any other way. And even then, you have to cop to the deception as soon as possible and make sure that they're okay and let them know why you did it that way. Make sure that they're okay before they leave the room, right? Now, there is less animal research that goes on in psychology than there used to be, but there is still some, right? Pretty much every university out there that engages in research, psychological research, will have an animal lab. Um, there are folks who feel like no animal research is acceptable. There are others who feel like we ought to be able to do whatever we want to animals because they're not human. Um, we fall somewhere in the middle, but more towards the hey, let's protect animals side, as we recognize that we have actually learned a lot about how the human brain functions and how certain principles of learning work based on animal research. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So we do still do animal research in psychology, but there are strict guidelines to make sure that those animals are being treated well, housed safely and humanely, fed properly, and if the research does require their euthanization so that we can, say, look at the brain connections more closely, um, then that euthanization happens in a humane manner um, and not unnecessarily, right? Now, as I was saying, there have been examples of, there are reasons why some people don't trust medical professionals and psychologists, and it's because people have abused their power in the past. And one of the most famous examples of this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This was actually more medical in nature than psychological. But from the 30s to the 70s, 1930s to 1970s, um, there were researchers in the U.S. Public Health Department that recruited poor rural black men here in the United States and that had syphilis, and then observed the progression of that disease. They never informed the men that they had syphilis, and successful medications were introduced as this experimentation was ongoing that cures syphilis, and they were not given the medications because the researchers wanted to view the progression of the disease. That's awful. I mean, it may not be murder, but it's certainly the next best thing to it. And this was some 400 men that lost their lives as they were being observed. And the researchers could have intervened at any time and did not. When this came to the public knowledge, there was rightfully a huge outcry. And one of the researchers who was involved in this study, in looking through his papers, it was actually discovered that U.S. Officials were actually intentionally infecting people with syphilis, both here and in Guatemala, in order to test the effectiveness of penicillin. You don't infect people with a disease just in order to treat them. And you want to treat people to make sure that you're not harming them, right? There was real harm that happened here. I don't know if you know anything about syphilis. Hopefully you don't. But it's a sexually transmitted infection where you get painful lesions on your genitalia, but then the lesions go away after a few weeks or a couple of months, and you think you're fine. But it is actually laying dormant in your system, and it lays dormant for about 10 years, and then your organs begin to fail, you experience psychosis, and you die. And that's what happened to these men. So this the publicization. Wow, I'm not sure. Anyways, when this came to light, it spurred a bunch of reforms, both in medical research and in psychological research, so that we can ever hope to have the confidence and trust of the people that we want to come be a part of our studies so that we can get accurate information. Okay, other things that we got to worry about ethically and a little bit more relevant to you as a student, we want to make sure that you are writing your own papers and not copy pasting from Wikipedia or from another student's paper or from anywhere else. And that when you are using somebody else's information, you give attribution to that person so that it doesn't look like, hey, I came up with this myself, or I just know this, right? You want to cite your sources. And this is something that we won't deal with a ton in this class just because we are not going to do a ton of writing. But as you move forward in psychology, you want to make sure that you are giving proper attribution to your sources and never copy pasting, because copy paste is not your friend in academia. Be careful about this. Every semester I have one or two students that I have to pull aside or email and say, hey, you turned in the same paper as somebody else. You're going to get a 0 on it, and if it happens again, you can get kicked out of school. I hate those conversations. I never want to have them. So let's not do that, okay? Enough said. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about. When it comes to the science of psychology, we've talked a lot about data collection, but really, if you collected a bunch of data, what you end up with as a researcher is an Excel spreadsheet full of numbers. What do you do with that? You can be like, hey, those are some awesome numbers. Sweet. That's not super useful. We want to be able to reduce those numbers down into something meaningful that we can compare between groups to see if those groups are different from each other, like we were talking about. In order to do that successfully, we need statistics. Now, there is a whole statistics class in psychology that you're going to have to take if you're a major. And I'm just going to give you the broad strokes right here because you can actually spend an entire semester and then some on this stuff. But I want you to at least be aware of these issues. Now, part of our statistics and our questions of measurement, right? We want to make sure that we are measuring what we think we're measuring and that we're doing it well, right? So we want our measures that we're using to test people, like the measures of self-control that I was using, for instance, that I described earlier. I want to make sure that those measures are both reliable and valid. So what's reliability? That means that a reliable measure is one that somebody could take over and over again and get a similar score because they're the same person, right? An IQ test, for instance, that if you take it repeatedly, it will give you the same score, or at least a very similar score in terms of what your IQ is. That is a reliable test or a reliable measure. We also want our measures to be valid, meaning that we want to make sure that we're measuring what we think we do. So I don't want my measurement of depression, for instance, to actually be measuring anxiety instead. Those might be similar to each other, but they're not the same thing. And so if my depression measurement actually is measuring concepts related to anxiety, that is not a valid measure because it's not what it says it is, right? So looking at our targets here on the screen, you can see the different possibilities. If something is reliable but not valid, that means that you're getting the same scores for somebody over and over again, but you're not actually hitting the center of the target. You're not actually measuring what you think you are, right? You can see in the second situation, the worst of all possible worlds, your measure is not reliable, so people get wildly different scores when they take it different times. And also, it's not measuring what you think it is. You're not hitting the center of the target. What we want is this third target here, where we are getting measurements that are both reliable and valid. We're measuring what we think we are, and we're measuring it in such a way that people will get similar scores if they were to take it repeated times. Okay, now, presuming that we have both reliable and valid measures, then what do I do with my numbers when I've got that spreadsheet in front of me? Well, I want to reduce those numbers down into a simpler number that is descriptive of what is going on in this group of people. So I want descriptive statistics. The simplest of these are our measures of centrality. If you want to describe what's going on in a big group of people, one of the simplest ways to do that is say what's going on in the middle, or to somehow find the middle of that group. Now, there's three different ways that we can measure the middle of a group. There is the mean, right? So this is what we usually use in mathematics. It's the average of everybody, right? So if I gather depression scores for our entire class, it'll probably be a higher number than we want it to be right now, but there it is. If I just took the average of all of your scores, that would be the mean, right? Now, the mean is the most commonly used measure of centrality in psychology. It is not always the best measure to use because sometimes we're measuring something that is not evenly distributed in the population, meaning there's most everybody clustered in one central spot, but then you have a few folks way out in the distance. So, for example, we're not necessarily talking about a psychological construct here, but let's look at net worth, right? If you were to look at average net worth in the United States, you would probably come up with a very high number that is not necessarily representative of what's going on in the group. Why? Because you've got a very small group of people who are worth a ton of money. You've got Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg really skewing, like if you're going to average all of those numbers together, you've got my net worth, which is a very small number, and then Jeff Bezos's net worth, and the average just finds the middle of all the numbers, right? That mean then is going to be pulled toward those very extreme outliers. And if you're trying to describe what's going on in the group, you're going to end up describing something that isn't actually accurate, right? If you have outliers. So this is one instance in which the mean is not the appropriate measure of centrality to use. If you have extreme outliers, do not use the mean because you'll end up with a number that is not descriptive of the group at large, right? Instead, what you're probably going to want to use is the median when you have outliers, right? The median is if you put all of the scores in order from lowest to highest, and then picked the middle score, that's the median. Okay? Um, we do this for things like net worth or home values here in the United States. When those get reported in the news, you'll notice they always use the median score. Because once again, it's what's going on in the middle of the group, right? If you put everybody in order and then just pick what's going on in the middle, that's probably going to be a pretty decent description of what the average is in that group, even though you're not actually calculating an average, right? Okay, so median is less sensitive to outliers than the mean is. The mode is simply the most frequently occurring score in a set of data. Um, this is sort of a funny figure to use for this because you actually have two modes where you can see there is a peak at 14 years and then another peak at 18 years. The mode really only gets used when you're dealing with categorical data, meaning things that don't have numbers attached to them but are just different groups. So for instance, ethnicity in the United States. There's no meaningful way to attach numbers to ethnicity to calculate an average or a median. And if you're trying to describe the group at large in a situation like that where there's no meaningful numbers attached, the easiest way to describe the group is what's the most commonly occurring value, right? So most commonly occurring value for ethnicity in the United States is Caucasian, I believe, still, although that's changing as our society sort of and immigration routes change, whatever. Anyways, once again, what we're trying to do here is reduce down complex data into something simple that you can sort of look and describe what's going on in this group of people, right? So your mean, your median, your mode. Make sure you know the difference amongst those three. Now, just because you know what's going on in the middle of the group doesn't necessarily mean you know everything about the group. There is another, you want to know not just what's the middle of my scores, but how much does this group vary around that middle? You can actually calculate a standard deviation for any group of scores. Once again, I'm not going to show you how to do it in this class. That's beyond our pay grade for 1010. Go take stats and you'll learn how to do that. The standard deviation describes how much scores vary on average around that mean, right? Because the mean is the most commonly used measure of centrality, but you don't necessarily know as much about the group with just the information about the mean as you do if you know the mean and the standard deviation. Because what the standard deviation says is, looking at this group of scores, here's the middle, here's the mean. How much on average do people deviate from that mean in this group? That's going to be your standard deviation. And that ends up being a very important number to help describe what's going on, in addition to knowing what your sort of center point is, right? Now, we use the mean and the standard deviation those are our descriptive statistics, sort of the ones that we use most frequently. But we want to move beyond just describing our group to inferring what's going on in this group beyond just the group itself, right? So we use what we call hypothesis testing to test whether the difference between our experimental group and our control group is big enough that it didn't just happen by chance, right? Because even though, statistically speaking, if you've got a big enough sample size, any individual differences should come out in the wash, and they should even each other out across large groups between our experimental group and our control group. Still, we manipulated one of these groups, and we're hoping to find some differences. But that washing out of individual differences is more theoretical than real, so you're going to end up with some small differences between your groups just because people are different from each other. Is the difference that I found between my groups big enough that I can say that it's a real difference and not just one that happened by random chance? That's the idea of inferential statistics and the idea of hypothesis testing, which once again, I won't get into too deeply because I just kind of want you to know that it exists and that we do it, and that's part of the science of psychology. It's not just gathering empirical data, although that's the first step, right? We want to gather empirical data, and then we want to run the proper statistical analyses on it so that we can say, here's a real difference between these groups, and I set up these groups properly so that I can generalize that outcome from beyond just my sample out to the population of interest that I'm concerned with. Because honestly, we don't care about our sample. We care about big groups of people. This is what we want to describe what's really going on with people generally, not just the group that we're looking at, right? And that's why we use inferential statistics to move beyond just the sample to sort of the population level, okay? That is the nuts and bolts, or at least the general pieces of the science of psychology. If you have any questions about any of this, please do feel free to reach out to me via email. I'm happy to chat with you about it. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and close this out for right now, and we'll come back to you with some more specific information about the brain and how it functions and all of that stuff next week. Okay, thanks everybody. I hope you have a good one. Take care.